Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into the central thesis of Naomi Klein's really controversial book, The Shock Doctrine. So the book lays out this pretty radical theory that a certain kind of free market capitalism didn't spread across the world because of freedom and democracy, but by taking advantage of moments when we, as a society, are at our most vulnerable.
And this idea, this quote from Milton Friedman, one of the most influential economists of the 20th century, well, that's basically the engine driving this entire theory. So let's see how it actually plays out.
First up, what exactly is disaster capitalism? Klein kicks things off with a powerful, real-world example, Hurricane Katrina, which just devastated New Orleans back in 2005.
You know, while residents were displaced, stranded, literally reeling from this unbelievable tragedy, a very different conversation was happening behind the scenes among politicians and developers. They didn't just see a tragedy, they saw a chance for a radical reset. This quote here from a developer really captures it. The flood gave them a clean sheet with very big opportunities.
And the most obvious example of this was the city's public school system. It was rapidly dismantled and replaced with privately run charter schools. And I mean, just look at these numbers, they're staggering. With most of the city's poorer residents still unable to come home, the number of public schools just plummeted from 123 to only 4. Meanwhile, charter schools quadrupled, and 4,700 union teachers lost their jobs. This is the essence of what Klein calls disaster capitalism, making these huge opportunistic changes while a city is literally on its knees.
Okay, so to really get to the psychological roots of this doctrine, Klein takes us somewhere you would absolutely not expect, to the CIA-funded experiments of a psychiatrist named Dr. Ewen Cameron, way back in the 1950s.
And this guy was a big deal. I mean, he was president of the World Psychiatric Association. But he had this really radical ambition. It wasn't just about helping his patients. He wanted to completely erase their minds and rebuild them from the ground up.
This method, which he called de-patterning, was basically a systematic assault on the mind. It started with total isolation and sensory deprivation. Then came these cocktails of experimental drugs. After that, terrifying levels of electroshock, way beyond any therapeutic dose. And the final step was something he called psychic driving, where he'd play these looped messages for weeks on end. And the goal through all of this? To create a blank slate where a new personality could be written.
And you better believe this research didn't just stay in the lab, it actually laid the foundation for the CIA's psychological torture method. The idea was twofold. First, you starve the senses through total isolation, and then you bombard the prisoner with overwhelming stimulation. The goal was to create a state of shock where a person is so disoriented, they just comply.
Right, so you're probably thinking, what on earth does a torture lab have to do with economics? Well, Klein argues that this logic of shock, erasure, and then remaking wasn't just in Cameron's lab. She draws a direct and pretty startling parallel to the work of another Dr. Shock, the economist Milton Friedman.
Klein argues that both of these men, as this table kind of lays out, shared the same core logic. Cameron wanted to erase personalities, Friedman wanted to erase policies. Cameron used physical shock, Friedman used economic shock, but the intended result in both cases was exactly the same: a shattered, disoriented subject, whether that's a patient or an entire society, that's unable to resist a radical new programming.
Okay, so where was the first real-world laboratory for this idea, for this societal shock doctrine? Well, according to Klein, it appeared in the 1970s, in a country that had been plunged into terror.
That laboratory was Chile. As this timeline shows, Klein argues that 3 different kinds of shock all came together at once. It started in 1973 with the shock of General Pinochet's violent military coup. Then in 1975 came the economic shock therapy advised by Friedman. And all of this was enforced by a third shock, the literal electroshock used in torture chambers to silence anyone who disagreed.
And the key to this economic shock therapy was speed. This wasn't about gradual, careful reform. No way. Friedman believed that if you imposed everything all at once, it would provoke psychological reactions in the public that would, in his words, facilitate the adjustment. It was a deliberate strategy to overwhelm a population that was already in shock.
And this quote from the writer Eduardo Galeano really captures how a lot of people saw this direct link between the two things. The brutal repression and the harsh economic policies, they weren't separate. They were partners, both needed to force through this new and deeply unequal reality.
All right, let's fast forward a bit. How did this whole doctrine evolve for the modern era?
Klein argues that in the post-9/11 world, the strategy mutated from just a tactic used every now and then into a full-blown global industry.
I mean, this quote is just chillingly honest. The war on terror and the fact that we're seeing more and more natural disasters, it all created this new, permanent state of crisis that became a huge, booming market all by itself.
Think about this number for a second. $200 billion. That's the estimated annual size of the global homeland security industry. This is a sector that was, for all intents and purposes, economically insignificant before 2001.
Klein gives this a name, the disaster capitalism complex, and as you can see, it includes everything from for-profit warfare and private security firms to the corporations that rebuild after disasters. The ultimate goal, she argues, is a fully privatized, for-profit state. And here's the key takeaway from this part. War and disaster are no longer just opportunities to open new markets, they are the market.
And so, the book leaves us with this central question. Where else is trauma being used to force through radical change? By giving us this framework, Klein invites us to look at world events not just as a series of random crises, but as a potential pattern of shock and opportunistic remake. It's a controversial way of looking at things for sure, but once you start seeing it, it's pretty hard to ignore. That's our explainer for today.